My mother did not bring a hostess gift when she walked into my $5 million New York penthouse. She brought a brass tape measure. I stood by the front door holding her wool coat while my father unspooled the metal tape across my custom hardwood floors. My sister's fiancé Todd was already pacing my living room, walking the length of the floor-to-ceiling glass windows and muttering numbers about property taxes under his breath. My name is Beverly Nelson. I was 29 the afternoon my family stopped pretending to love me and started treating my home like an open house. I built a software company from a folding table in a cramped studio apartment and sold it for enough to buy the penthouse in cash. I earned every inch of that skyline view with years of skipped holidays and sleepless nights. If you know what it feels like to work your fingers to the bone while your own family treats your success like a public resource to be plundered, you already know the knot I felt in my stomach watching them. Welcome to Grape Vengeance, where we sit with the quiet betrayals of ordinary families and the steady people who walk away from them whole. Drop a comment to let me know your age and where you are watching from, because the audacity you are about to hear crosses all state lines. The trap started with a simple phone call. Diane, my mother, had not spoken to me in 6 months. She called on a Tuesday and announced I was hosting my sister Valerie's wedding rehearsal dinner. She did not ask if I was free. She presented it as an olive branch. Valerie was marrying Todd Harrison, a man my parents constantly reminded me came from old money. They said the dinner was a chance to mend fences before the big day. I agreed to do it because some stubborn part of me still wanted a family that sat at a dinner table and just acted like a normal family. I wanted a truce. I got a hostile takeover instead. The elevator doors opened directly into my private foyer that Thursday afternoon. Diane walked in first. She did not say hello. She did not look at my face. She looked past my shoulder at the vaulted ceilings. Richard followed right behind her, sliding that tape measure out of his jacket pocket before he even took his shoes off. Todd did not bother to introduce himself to me. He wore a tailored suit and a smirk that felt rehearsed. He bypassed the pleasantries, walked past me without a word, and went straight for the windows overlooking the city. The natural light in the primary suite will be perfect for Valerie's morning routine, Diane said to Richard. She spoke like I was the hired help standing in the hallway waiting for a coat check tip. Richard nodded and snapped the tape measure flat against the wall leading to the guest wing. We will need to tear out these modern fixtures, Richard said, writing a number down on a small notepad. Todd prefers traditional molding. I tightened my grip on Diane's coat. My name was the only one on the deed. I paid the property taxes. I bought the fixtures they were talking about tearing out. For my entire life, my parents funded Valerie's art history degree and her trips to Europe while I ate instant noodles and wrote code. My ambition was a character defect to them, right up until it came with a doorman. Diane finally turned to look at me. Her eyes held that familiar, cold calculation I knew from childhood. Beverly, you need to clear out your home office by tomorrow morning, she said. Valerie and Todd will be taking the master bedroom for the weekend. They need the space to decompress. I kept my voice perfectly level. The one thing business negotiations taught me is that anger gives manipulators the exact ammunition they want to call you crazy. The guest wing has 2 large bedrooms with ensuite bathrooms, I said. My office stays exactly where it is. My bedroom stays mine. Richard sighed. It was the heavy, exaggerated sigh of a man dealing with a stubborn toddler. He walked over and cornered me near the kitchen island, leaning his weight against the marble. You are a single woman holding on to a 5-bedroom penthouse, he said softly. It is selfish. Your sister is trying to start a family. You could show a little grace for once in your life. He said the word selfish the way a doctor diagnoses a disease. Not take the bait. I did not argue. I hung up the coats in the hall closet and went to the kitchen to pour a glass of ice water, listening to the clinking cubes to keep my heart rate steady. 10 minutes later, I walked down the hall to my home office to grab my laptop. The heavy mahogany door was cracked open. Todd was standing behind my desk. He had my top drawer pulled open and his fingers were sifting through my private financial documents. He was not looking at wedding seating charts. He was holding my bank statements and the property deed paperwork. I stepped into the doorway. "Are you looking for something specific, Todd?" He did not flinch. He did not drop the papers. He slowly placed the deed back into the drawer, pushed it shut, and gave me that same practiced smirk. "Just looking for a pen, Beverly." His eyes were dark and entirely unbothered. He walked past me close enough that I could smell the heavy musk of his expensive cologne and went back to the living room like he owned the hallway. Valerie finally arrived an hour later. The building doorman brought her 4 oversized suitcases up on a brass luggage cart. She stepped off the elevator, wearing designer sunglasses indoors. She looked at my sleek modern furniture, the leather sofas and the glass accent tables. She wrinkled her nose like she smelled spoiled milk. "This place is so sterile," she announced to the room, dropping her designer handbag on my sofa. "It feels like a dentist waiting room. We are going to have to gut this entire layout before we can host any of Todd's friends next month." She said the word "we" effortlessly. Every conversation, every subtle dig, every physical movement they made in my home was a calculated attempt to make me feel small in the space I paid for with my own sweat. They were testing my boundaries, prodding the fence to see how much ground I would surrender just to keep the peace. I stood by the kitchen island, tracing the cold edge of the marble countertop with my thumb, observing their strategy. By midnight, the penthouse was quiet. My parents and sister were asleep in the guest wing. I sat alone in my home office with the door locked, staring at the financial folder Todd had been touching. The pieces slid into place, forming a picture I could no longer ignore. The rehearsal dinner was just a convenient excuse. The real objective of this trip to New York was extracting my primary asset, and this weekend was just the staging ground for a robbery. They thought because I stayed quiet I was weak. They thought because I always crave a normal family, I would hand over my life to buy their affection. They had no idea I was already doing the math, preparing a ledger they could never afford to pay. I woke up Friday morning before the sun crested the city skyline. I craved the quiet. I poured espresso into a ceramic mug and stood by the kitchen island watching the morning light hit the glass. The silence lasted exactly 12 minutes. My mother walked into the kitchen wearing a silk robe. I recognized the floral pattern immediately. She had gone into my private dressing room, bypassed my clothes, and helped herself to a garment I bought in Milan. She did not ask. She poured herself a cup of coffee and leaned against the counter. "Your guest bed is far too firm," Diane said. Todd woke up with a terrible ache in his shoulder. "We need you to call building management and have a softer mattress brought up before tonight." I took a slow sip of my espresso. "Building management handles leaks and security, Mom. They do not run a concierge mattress service." Diane sighed, rolling her eyes toward the ceiling. "Well, you need to fix it. Todd's parents arrive for the rehearsal cocktail party this evening, and we cannot have him looking exhausted. The Harrisons expect a certain standard of living. I also need you to call a professional cleaning crew. The baseboards in the guest wing are dusty. I cleaned those baseboards myself 2 days ago." I kept my face blank. "I will handle the dust," I said. She waved her hand in the air, dismissing my response. "Just stay out of the way tonight, Beverly. Pour the wine, ensure the caterers keep the trays full, and let Valerie shine. This weekend is about her future. We do not need your workaholic energy ruining the mood." The doorbell buzzed. It was only 8 in the morning. I set my mug down and walked toward the foyer, but Richard beat me to it. He swung the heavy front door open like he paid the mortgage. Two men in neat polo shirts stood in the hallway, holding digital laser measures and thick clipboards. "Right on time," Richard said, ushering them inside. I stepped into the entryway, crossing my arms. "Who are these gentlemen, Dad?" Richard offered a tight, forced smile. "Just some staging consultants for the party tonight, sweetheart. I wanted to make sure the flow of the room works for the guest list. We need to know how many tables we can fit near the terrace." I watched the two men. They did not look at the terrace. They did not ask about table sizes. The taller man aimed his laser measure at the ceiling, calculating the height of the vaulted dome. The second man knocked a knuckle against the hallway drywall, listening for the hollow sound of non-load-bearing studs. They were not planning a party layout. They were running a quiet, unauthorized property appraisal. I stepped right into the taller man's path. I held out my hand. "I am Beverly Nelson, the homeowner," I said. "I would love one of your business cards for my records." The man blinked, lowering his laser tool. He reached into his pocket and handed me a thick card. It did not say event staging. It read, "Premier Real Estate Valuations and Consulting." I looked at the card, then looked at my father. Richard shifted his weight from his left foot to his right. A thin bead of sweat formed at his hairline. "Just checking the market value of the neighborhood," Richard muttered, shoving his hands into his pockets. "A smart businessman always knows the numbers, Beverly. You taught me that." I placed the business card in my pocket. "You have 10 minutes to finish measuring my walls, gentlemen," I told the appraisers. "Then I need my home back." The men packed their gear and scurried out the door 5 minutes later. Richard glared at me, his jaw clenched tight, but he said nothing. He turned and retreated down the hall toward the guest wing. He knew I caught him in a lie, but in his mind, my property was already his to evaluate. The psychological pressure escalated over breakfast. I ordered a modest spread of bagels and fruit from the deli downstairs. Valerie walked into the dining room dressed in a cashmere sweater set, followed closely by Todd. Todd took the seat at the head of my table without asking. He poured coffee, buttered a bagel, and stared at me across the expanse of the room. "So, Beverly," Todd said, his tone dripping with fake curiosity. "What are the bylaws like in this building? Do they restrict subletting? How strict is the homeowner association regarding major renovations?" I buttered a piece of toast. "The board is strict, Todd. They prefer owners who actually live in the units they purchase." Todd smirked, swirling the dark coffee in his mug. "Interesting. Because a space this large for just one person." He shook his head slowly, clicking his tongue. "It is a terrible waste of capital. You could easily split this unit into 2 rentals, or better yet, gut the kitchen and flip it for a substantial margin. The Harrisons have a developer friend who specializes in this exact zip code." Valerie chimed in, picking a single strawberry from the bowl. "Todd is right, Bev. It is almost greedy, hoarding all this square footage. You sit up here alone with your computers. It is sad. A home like this needs a real family to fill it. Someone who appreciates the lifestyle." She stared directly into my eyes when she said the word family. She was telling me I did not qualify. She was telling me I was just the current occupant, keeping the seat warm for the rightful owners. "You have a beautiful eye for art," Todd added, gesturing to the expensive paintings I bought at a charity auction. "But the layout is wrong. When Valerie and I find our place in the city, we plan to bring in a real architect, someone who understands legacy." They were painting a picture of my erasure. They were sitting at my table eating my food, actively discussing the demolition of my life. Every word was designed to make me feel small, temporary, and unworthy of my own achievements. They wanted me to crack. They wanted me to raise my voice and demand respect, which would give them the green light to label me a jealous, bitter spinster trying to ruin her younger sister's happiness. I swallowed my bite of toast. I dabbed my mouth with a linen napkin. "I am sure you and Valerie will find a lovely starter apartment, Todd. The rental market is very accommodating right now." Todd narrowed his eyes. The smirk vanished from his face. Valerie scoffed, pushing her chair back from the table. "You always do this," Valerie snapped. "You always have to be the smartest person in the room. You just cannot be happy for me." She stormed out of the dining room, retreating to her stolen bedroom. Todd stood up slowly, tossed his napkin onto his plate, and followed her, leaving me alone with the quiet hum of the refrigerator. I cleared the plates. I loaded the dishwasher. I focused on the warm water running over my hands. They were trying to break my spirit through 1,000 tiny cuts. They assumed my wealth made me soft. They forgot I spent 7 years fighting off hostile corporate takeovers in the tech sector. I knew how to read a boardroom, and my family was currently playing a very weak hand. Later that afternoon, the catering company arrived to set up for the rehearsal cocktail party. Diane was everywhere, micromanaging the staff, rearranging my furniture to suit her tastes, and hiding my personal photographs in a storage closet because she claimed my frames clashed with her floral arrangements. I watched her erase my presence from my own living room. I stepped into my home office to escape the noise and check a few work emails. I sat down at my desk and opened my laptop. Something felt wrong. The air in the room was stale. I glanced at my desk organizer. The silver pen holder was shifted 2 inches to the left. The leather-bound folder containing my property deed and insurance documents was sitting at a slight angle. I am a software engineer. I do not rely on locks and keys alone. I opened a hidden application on my laptop and accessed the discrete security camera installed in the corner of my office ceiling. I rewound the footage to the previous night, right after I caught Todd looking for a pen. The grainy video played on my screen. I watched Todd wait until I walked down the hall. I watched him sneak back into my office. He pulled open the drawer. He took out the property deed, but this time he did not just read it. He pulled his smartphone out of his pocket and took 4 clear, high-resolution photographs of my legal documents, capturing my signatures and the exact legal boundaries of the penthouse. I paused the video. I stared at Todd's digital face, glowing on my monitor. He was gathering intelligence. He was building a legal profile on my asset. The wedding rehearsal happening in my living room tonight was nothing but a distraction. They were not planning a marriage, they were planning a heist. I closed the laptop screen. A cold, heavy calm settled over my shoulders. The kind of calm that arrives when you finally stop hoping for a better outcome and accept the war you are currently standing in. The doorbell began ringing at 5 o'clock. The Harrisons arrived in a flurry of expensive coats and loud, practiced laughter. I walked out of my office to greet them. I wore a simple black dress, determined to play the gracious host. Richard intercepted me in the hallway before I could reach the foyer. He grabbed my elbow, his grip tight enough to leave a mark. "Listen to me," Beverly, Richard hissed, pulling me close so the guests could not hear. "Todd's parents are very influential people. They do not know about your little internet company, and we prefer to keep it that way. Old money does not respect new money. We told them you managed this property for an overseas investor." I stared at my father's hand gripping my arm. "You told my future in-laws that I am a glorified superintendent?" "It is easier this way," Richard said, releasing my arm and smoothing his tie. "It makes Valerie look more grounded. If they think she has a rich, snobby sister, they might think she is just marrying Todd for a lifestyle upgrade. You owe her this. Just pour the drinks and stay out of the family photos tonight." He patted my shoulder and walked away to greet a woman dripping in diamonds. I stood in the hallway of the $5 million home I owned, listening to my father strip away my identity to build a fraudulent pedestal for his favorite child. They did not just want my property. They wanted my ghost. They needed me invisible so they could step into the space I created and claim it as their own. I walked into the living room, picked up a tray of champagne flutes, and smiled. I was going to serve them their drinks. I was going to let them pretend. I was going to let them build their house of cards as high as they possibly could right here in my living room. Because the higher they built it, the harder the fall would be when I finally pulled the table out from under them. The first guests for the rehearsal cocktail party filed into my foyer just after 6 o'clock. Diane had hired a local jazz trio to play in the corner of the living room, and a team of caterers circulated with silver trays of hors d'oeuvres. I stood near the kitchen island wearing a simple tailored blouse, keeping a watchful eye on the staff to ensure my hardwood floors were not scratched. Todd's parents arrived 30 minutes later. Winston and Victoria Harrison walked through my front doors carrying an air of practiced superiority. Victoria wore a string of pearls that looked heavy enough to cause neck pain, and Winston scanned the room with the critical eye of a man used to evaluating other people's net worth. Diane intercepted them before they could even remove their coats. She kissed Victoria on both cheeks and linked arms with Winston, guiding them toward the floor-to-ceiling windows. "The view is breathtaking," Victoria remarked, tapping a manicured fingernail against the glass. "You must have an exquisite eye for real estate, Diane. Finding a gem like this in the city is nearly impossible." Diane waved a hand through the air, claiming the compliment without a hint of shame. It took months of negotiations, but I always know a good investment when I see one. I picked up a tray of champagne flutes and walked toward the group. I held the silver platter steady, offering a glass to Victoria. She took one, her gaze drifting over my plain blouse. "And who is this quiet girl taking care of the glassware?" Victoria asked, not bothering to look me in the eye. Diane did not miss a beat. "Oh, this is Beverly. She's the property manager for the overseas investors who own this unit. She's just helping out tonight to make sure the catering staff knows where the utility closets are located." My fingers tightened around the edge of the silver tray. I did not drop it. The glass stems did not rattle. I spent my 20s pitching software algorithms to rooms full of skeptical venture capitalists. I knew how to swallow an insult and keep my face neutral. I offered a glass to Winston, nodded politely, and walked away. Diane wanted me to interrupt. She wanted me to announce my ownership loudly so she could pull Victoria aside and whisper about my desperate need for attention. I refused to play the game. An hour into the party, a man carrying a heavy camera bag arrived. Diane had hired a professional photographer to take candid shots of the families mingling. She clapped her hands together and marched across the room to where I was standing near the appetizers. "Beverly, go to the back room and put on the dress you bought for the wedding ceremony tomorrow," Diane ordered. I frowned. "The ceremony is tomorrow, Mom. I'm working tonight." "The photographer needs to test his flash aperture against the skyline," she insisted, her voice tight with artificial sweetness. "You bought that ridiculous silver silk gown. We need to make sure the fabric does not reflect too much light and ruin the group portraits. Go change, now." I walked down the hall to my bedroom. The dress hanging in my closet was a custom-tailored masterpiece. I bought it as a quiet celebration for closing a major software contract. It represented my independence. I slipped out of my blouse and carefully zipped the silver silk up my back. It fit perfectly, skimming my frame and pooling elegantly around my heels. I walked back down the hallway and stepped into the living room. The jazz music hummed. The guests were laughing. Valerie was standing near the center rug. She held a wide crystal goblet filled to the brim with dark red Cabernet. She was talking to Todd, but her eyes tracked my movement the moment I entered the room. I walked toward the photographer. Valerie stepped away from Todd and moved directly into my path. She did not stumble, she did not trip over her heels. The floor was perfectly flat. Valerie stopped inches in front of me. She looked me dead in the eye. Her expression held a chilling, hollow blankness. Without breaking eye contact, she tilted her wrist forward. The heavy red wine splashed across my chest. The dark liquid cascaded down the front of the silver silk, soaking through the delicate fabric instantly. The cold shock of the alcohol hit my skin. The stain spread like a blooming bruise, ruining the dress beyond any hope of dry cleaning. The jazz trio stopped playing. The room went dead silent. Diane swooped in before a single drop of wine hit the floor. She did not offer me a towel. She did not ask if I was all right. "Beverly, why are you hovering in the middle of a high-traffic area?" Diane scolded, her voice carrying across the quiet room. "You startled your sister. You are always underfoot." Valerie put a hand to her chest, feigning a gasp. "I am so sorry, Todd," Valerie said, turning to her fiancé instead of me. "My sister just appeared out of nowhere." Diane grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the hallway. "I knew you would find a way to cause a scene," Diane hissed under her breath, "but I came prepared." She opened the hall closet and pulled out a plastic dry-cleaning bag. She shoved it into my chest. "I brought a backup dress for you," Diane said loudly, ensuring the Harrisons heard every word. "Go put this on, and please try to carry yourself with a little grace for the rest of the evening." I walked into the guest bathroom and locked the door. I pulled the backup dress out of the plastic. It was a frumpy, oversized mustard yellow monstrosity. The fabric was a stiff, scratchy polyester that smelled like mothballs. It featured a high ruffled collar and puffy sleeves. It was at least 3 sizes too big. I stared at the hideous garment in the mirror. The trap was beautifully constructed. They intentionally destroyed my expensive gown and handed me a clown suit. They wanted me to burst into tears. They wanted me to throw the ugly dress on the floor, march out into the living room, and scream at Valerie. If I lost my temper, Diane would shake her head sadly and tell Todd's wealthy parents that I had always been mentally unstable. They were trying to manufacture a public meltdown to discredit my character. I took a deep breath. I peeled the ruined wine-soaked silk off my body and threw it in the trash can. I pulled the mustard yellow dress over my head. It hung off my shoulders like a cheap tent. I reached into my makeup bag, pulled out 2 safety pins, and gathered the excess fabric at my waist, pinning it tight. I opened the bathroom door and walked right back into the party. I did not shed a single tear. I did not glare at my sister. I picked up an empty silver tray, offered a warm smile to Victoria Harrison, and began collecting discarded appetizer plates. Valerie watched me from across the room. Her jaw tightened when she realized I was not going to give her the explosion she desperately needed. By 9 o'clock, the air in the penthouse felt suffocating. The scratchy polyester collar rubbed my neck raw. I needed 5 minutes of silence. I slipped through the sliding glass doors and stepped out onto the wraparound balcony. The night air was crisp. The distant hum of city traffic drifted up from the streets below. I walked toward the far corner of the terrace, seeking the shadows near the brick partition. I heard a voice. Richard was standing on the other side of the brick divider. He was hidden from the living room windows, pacing back and forth in the dark. He held his cell phone pressed tight against his ear. He was not using his confident, booming business voice. He sounded frantic. "I told you to stop calling my wife," Richard hissed into the receiver. "We are handling the liquidity issue." I stopped moving. I pressed my back flat against the cold brick wall and held my breath. "I know the deadline is Tuesday," Richard continued, his voice trembling slightly. "You just need to hold off the bank for 3 more days. The New York asset will be officially transferred by Saturday night. The paperwork is already drawn up." A pause followed as the person on the other end spoke. Richard ran a hand through his hair, his silhouette shifting in the moonlight. "Yes, the entire property," Richard promised. "The debts will be cleared by Monday morning. I will wire the funds directly to the escrow account. Just do not file the foreclosure notice on our primary estate. If my future son-in-law finds out I am underwater, this entire deal falls apart." He ended the call. I heard the sharp click of his phone snapping shut. I stood frozen in the dark. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together with sickening clarity. The ruined dress, the fake appraisal, the gaslighting, the insistence on hosting the dinner in my home. None of it was about sibling rivalry. It was about survival. My parents were completely broke. They were drowning in debt and facing the loss of their own home. They did not come to New York to celebrate a marriage. They came to steal a $5 million penthouse to pay off their creditors. And they needed me to look crazy, isolated, and broken so that no one would question them when they forced me to sign over the deed. I waited in the cold shadows of the balcony until Richard walked back through the sliding glass doors. The shock of his desperate phone conversation vanished, replaced by a cold and calculated focus in my mind. I knew their exact motive now. They were cornered animals backed into a financial wall. I smoothed the rough fabric of my pin dress, took a deep breath of the crisp night air, and stepped back into the bright lights of my living room. The front buzzer echoed over the soft jazz music. The building doorman announced a new arrival over the intercom. Diane rushed toward the entryway, practically shoving a hired waiter out of her path. Richard abandoned his conversation with Winston Harrison and jogged to join his wife. They formed a frantic and desperate welcoming committee near the coat closet. The heavy oak door swung inward. Henry Nelson walked into the foyer. My grandfather was 78 years old. He built a logistics company from a single delivery truck in the 1970s and turned it into a regional shipping empire. He walked with a silver-handled cane due to a bad hip, but his posture remained perfectly straight. He possessed the sharp and unforgiving eyes of a man who spent 50 years spotting liars in boardrooms. He was also the only person sharing my bloodline who ever respected my ambition and my work ethic. Diane immediately threw her arms around his neck, kissing his cheek with exaggerated enthusiasm. "Dad, you made it!" she squealed, her voice unnaturally high and grating. "We were so worried the city traffic would exhaust you. Let Richard take your coat." Richard hovered close behind her, nodding vigorously, like a subordinate employee trying to impress the boss. "We saved the best seat for you, Henry. Can I get you a scotch?" My parents treated him like a fragile and senile bank vault. They hovered over him constantly, terrified he might rewrite his will if they failed to fetch his slippers fast enough. They believed his age made him blind to their greed. Henry did not smile. He handed his wool overcoat to Richard without looking at him. He stepped around Diane, leaning slightly on his cane, and scanned the room. His eyes swept past the jazz trio. They skipped over Todd and his wealthy parents. His gaze bypassed the elegant floral arrangements and landed directly on me. I was standing near the kitchen island, holding a stack of dirty appetizer plates, wearing a bright yellow and oversized polyester dress pinned together at the waist. I looked like a destitute servant, hired to clean up after a royal banquet. I was physically isolated from the rest of the family, confined to the edges of the room by Diane's careful social engineering. Henry did not gasp. He did not ask what happened to my clothes. He understood the dynamic instantly. He recognized the deliberate cruelty of my outfit and the physical distance my family maintained from me. Instead of confronting Diane, he simply walked toward a high-backed leather armchair positioned near the corner of the room. It was a strategic choice. From that chair, he commanded a full view of the entire living room, the terrace doors, and the kitchen hallway. He sat down, crossed his hands over the silver head of his cane, and watched them work. Diane spent the next 30 minutes trying to force Valerie into Henry's line of sight. She paraded my sister and Todd past the leather chair, loudly listing the expensive details of the wedding ceremony planned for the following day. Henry nodded politely, but his expression remained entirely unreadable. He gave them nothing. I finished loading the dishwasher and wiped down the marble counters. I poured a measure of single malt scotch into a crystal tumbler and walked across the living room, ignoring the pitiful glances from the Harrison family. I approached the leather chair and handed the glass to my grandfather. "You look like a canary that lost a fight with a lawnmower," Henry said softly, taking the tumbler from my hand. "It was the only backup dress my mother brought," I replied, keeping my voice extremely low so the sound would not carry over the music. Henry took a slow sip of his scotch. He did not look at me. His eyes tracked Richard, who was currently laughing too hard at a joke Winston Harrison told near the balcony. "They are moving very fast tonight," Henry murmured. "Desperate people make careless mistakes, Beverly. Watch their hands, not their mouths." He validated my entire reality with a single sentence. He knew they were running a scam. He did not reveal how much he knew, but he confirmed I was not losing my mind. A profound sense of relief washed over me. I was not fighting this war entirely alone. Before I could respond, Todd sauntered over to the armchair. He held a glass of bourbon and wore a confident and predatory grin. He leaned against the side table next to Henry, invading the older man's personal space with aggressive familiarity. "Henry, it is great to finally see you," Todd said, speaking far too loudly. "Valerie tells me you built quite the impressive little supply chain business back in the day." Henry did not look up. He stared straight ahead. "It was adequate, Todd." Todd chuckled, swirling the ice in his glass. "Well, the market is shifting. Valerie and I are looking to build her real estate portfolio as soon as we tie the knot tomorrow. We want to secure a few multifamily units in Manhattan." Todd paused, leaning much closer. "We were actually wondering when you plan on liquidating your heavier assets. A man your age should be enjoying his retirement, not worrying about estate management. Passing some of that capital down now would give Valerie a massive head start in the market." I stood frozen next to the chair. Todd had just casually suggested my grandfather liquidate his life savings and hand over the cash to fund their fictional real estate empire. The sheer audacity was staggering. Todd was probing the vault, trying to determine if Henry was an easy target who could be talked out of his fortune. Henry turned his head slowly. He looked at Todd. He did not yell. He did not throw his drink in the younger man's face. Henry offered a cold and polite smile. It was the kind of smile a shark gives before it bites. "I appreciate your concern for my retirement," Todd Henry said smoothly. "I am currently evaluating all of my investments. I assure you my assets will go exactly where they belong." Todd grinned, entirely missing the subtle threat layered beneath the words. "That is what I like to hear. Family first, right?" Todd patted Henry on the shoulder and walked back toward Valerie, looking incredibly pleased with his own negotiation skills. Henry watched him walk away. The polite smile vanished from his face. He pulled a small leather notebook from his breast pocket, clicked a pen, and jotted down a single line of text. He closed the notebook and slipped it away. The silent observer was gathering data, building a case, just like I was. I turned to walk back to the kitchen, but Valerie intercepted me in the hallway. She grabbed my forearm, dragging me past the swinging door and into the pantry, completely out of sight from the guests in the living room. Her face was flushed dark red. The fake sweetness she displayed for the Harrisons was completely gone. "What exactly do you think you are doing?" Valerie hissed, her voice vibrating with suppressed rage. I pulled my arm out of her grip. "I am bringing Grandpa his drink." Valerie stepped closer, pointing a manicured finger at my chest. "Do not play innocent with me. I saw you whispering with him. You are deliberately trying to steal his attention tonight." I looked down at the hideous yellow polyester bunched around my waist. "I am wearing a clown suit, Valerie. I am clearing dirty napkins. I am practically invisible. You are doing it on purpose." She snapped her eyes wide and erratic. "You wore that hideous thing just to make me look like a terrible sister. You are trying to ruin my wedding aesthetic. You want Todd's parents to think we treat you badly, so they will feel sorry for you." She was projecting her own malice onto me. She orchestrated the spilled wine, she planned the humiliation, and now she was furious that I was surviving it with quiet dignity. She needed me to break down so she could justify her cruelty to the outside world. "This weekend is about me," Valerie continued, her voice rising in pitch. Tomorrow is my day, my future. You need to back off and stop manipulating Grandpa against us. She spun around and shoved the pantry door open, storming back into the party to reclaim the spotlight before anyone noticed she was gone. I stood alone in the quiet kitchen, listening to the hum of the refrigerator. The puzzle was complete. They were bankrupt. They needed my penthouse to survive the week. And tomorrow morning, when the sun came up on my sister's wedding day, they were going to spring the final trap. They had absolutely no idea I was ready for them. Dawn broke over the Manhattan skyline, with a pale gray light washing the city in a cold glow. The morning of the wedding arrived with all the grace of a scheduled demolition. By 7 o'clock, my quiet penthouse transformed into a loud and chaotic staging ground. 3 hired makeup artists rolled heavy aluminum cases through my front door, taking over the guest wing. They plugged professional ring lights and curling irons into every available wall outlet. The heavy, suffocating scent of aerosol hairspray and expensive floral perfume hung thick in the air, barely masking the stale tension lingering from the night before. 4 bridesmaids ran frantically down the hardwood hallway. They wore matching pink silk robes, giggling loudly and holding crystal flutes filled with expensive champagne I paid for. I navigated around their frantic energy, carrying a large silver tray of fresh croissants and fruit I had plated in the kitchen. I walked into the primary guest bedroom and placed the pastry tray on a small side table near the window. Valerie sat in the center of the room, facing a large, lighted vanity mirror. A stylist stood behind her, pulling her hair into an intricate updo. Valerie was scrolling rapidly through her smartphone. She did not look up. She did not say thank you when I set the food down inches from her arm. She treated me exactly like an invisible catering employee. I stepped back, observing the forced joy and the frantic pacing of the bridal party. The contrast between the celebratory atmosphere and the dark reality of my family's financial ruin was jarring. Diane stood near the large corner window, watching the street traffic below. She wore a slate-gray mother-of-the-bride suit that looked sharp, structured, and unforgiving. She checked her silver wristwatch. As soon as I took a step toward the doorway to leave, Diane clapped her hands together. The sharp, smacking sound cut through the chatter and the background music like a knife. "All right, ladies," Diane announced to the crowded room. "We need some strict privacy for a few moments. Family business. Everyone else needs to go downstairs to the lobby and check on the floral deliveries right now." The bridesmaids grabbed their phones and scurried out of the room, leaving a trail of nervous whispers in their wake. The makeup artists quickly packed their brushes, unplugged their lights, and stepped out into the hallway. The last woman pulled the heavy oak door shut behind her. The click of the metal latch sounded incredibly loud in the sudden heavy silence. Valerie remained seated at the vanity. She set her phone face down on the glass table and stared at her own reflection. Diane walked slowly across the plush carpet. She positioned her body directly between me and the only exit. The polite high society mask she wore for the Harrisons melted away, replaced by a cold and calculating stare. Diane crossed her arms over her chest. "I need the spare set of electronic keycards for the front door," she said, her voice devoid of any warmth. "I also require the master security codes for the private elevator access panel." I looked at her, forcing my heart rate to remain steady. I kept my breathing slow and even. "Why do you need unrestricted access to my building, Mom?" Diane sighed, tilting her head back. She adopted the patronizing tone of a weary teacher explaining a simple math problem to a very slow child. "Todd and Valerie are going to spend a 6-month honeymoon trial living here in the penthouse. They need to establish a strong footprint in the city before they start house hunting for a permanent estate. It is the only logical choice for their social standing. You travel for business anyway. You will hardly notice they are living here." She spoke with terrifying certainty. She delivered the demand as if she were informing me of a weather forecast instead of trying to take possession of my private home. Valerie watched me through the mirror, her eyes tracking my every movement to see if I would break. "That is not going to happen," I replied evenly, keeping my hands resting loosely at my sides. "Nobody moves into my unit. My home is not a vacation rental." Diane stepped closer. Her perfume smelled sharp and metallic, burning the back of my throat. "This is not a request, Beverly. The Harrisons expect Valerie to maintain a certain standard of living in New York. Todd told his parents they secured a luxury property for their first year of marriage. You are going to hand over those electronic keys before we leave for the ceremony." I stood my ground, refusing to shrink back from her physical intimidation. "You are asking me to surrender my home so your son-in-law can pretend he is a millionaire. The answer remains no." Valerie spun around in her padded chair, the fabric squeaking under her sudden movement. "I told you she would be selfish," Valerie snapped at our mother, pointing an accusing finger at me. "She wants me to look poor in front of Todd's friends. She wants to ruin my life because she is jealous." Diane raised a hand, silencing my sister instantly. She locked her eyes on mine. Her expression hardened into something incredibly dangerous and feral. "If you refuse to cooperate," Diane said, her voice dropping to a low, venomous hiss, "I will stand up at the reception tonight and tell the entire guest list exactly how you funded your little software startup." I frowned, genuinely confused for a fraction of a second. "I funded my startup by working 3 jobs and securing a small business loan from a local bank." Diane smiled. It was a cold, cruel stretching of her lips that did not reach her eyes. "That is not the story I am going to tell," she whispered. "I am going to tell Todd's influential parents, the wealthy investors at the table, and everyone sitting in that room that you stole Richard's retirement fund. I will announce that you forged his signature to secure your initial capital, leaving your own father destitute and broken." A jolt of adrenaline hit my system cold and sharp. The lie was staggering. It was entirely verifiable as false through a simple audit of my financial records. But Diane did not care about the truth. She cared about the spectacle and the immediate damage. She knew I operated in a corporate world where reputation is the only currency that matters. A public accusation of financial fraud screamed by my own mother in front of 200 people would trigger immediate panic among my board members and investors. The scandal would stick to my name long enough to cause severe, irreparable damage before I could ever clear it in a court of law. "You are blackmailing me," I stated. I kept my voice flat, stating the fact plainly so it hung in the air between us like a physical object. "I am protecting my family," Diane countered, smoothly, not flinching at the word blackmail. "You have until the dinner service tonight to hand over the electronic keys and the signed property transfer paperwork. If I do not have that deed in my hand before the wedding cake is cut, I will destroy your professional reputation. I will make sure every venture capitalist in New York hears that Beverly Nelson robbed her aging parents to get ahead." She delivered the ultimatum with terrifying practiced ease. She truly believed she held all the leverage in the room. She looked at me, waiting to see terror wash over my face. She wanted to see me crumble, cry, and beg her not to ruin my life. She wanted me to surrender. I looked at the woman who raised me. I looked at the sister who sat silently watching the extortion unfold, looking incredibly satisfied with the threat. I realized the profound, staggering scope of their delusion. They spent their entire lives treating me like an obedient workhorse. Because I always avoided screaming matches, because I always chose peace over petty conflict, they mistook my discipline for weakness. They genuinely believed they could bully a technology chief executive officer out of a $5 million asset using playground threats and fake tears. I did not raise my voice. I did not try to reason with them. Reason requires a shared reality, and my parents had abandoned reality months ago. "I understand your terms, Diane," I said quietly. Diane smirked victorious, believing she had won the war. Valerie turned back to the mirror, picking up a tube of lipstick. "I will see you both at the venue," I added. I turned around, opened the heavy oak door, and walked out of the guest wing. I walked down the hall to my master bedroom and locked the door behind me. I pulled a sleek leather garment bag from my closet and began packing my things for the wedding venue. My hands were perfectly steady. I did not shake. I folded my clothes with meticulous precision, analyzing the variables of the upcoming reception. I walked over to my desk, opened the bottom drawer, and pulled out a small plain manila folder. It contained the financial autopsy my grandfather had compiled. I placed the folder securely into my handbag. My parents thought they had me backed into an impossible corner. They thought the threat of public humiliation would force me into total submission. They did not understand that I survived the cutthroat technology sector by always staying 3 steps ahead of hostile competitors. The trap was fully set. The bait was in place. They were marching toward the reception armed with lies. But they had no idea they were the ones walking straight into a financial firing squad. I zipped my bag shut, grabbed my coat, and headed for the elevator, ready to watch their entire world burn. The taxi dropped me off in front of a sprawling event hall in the heart of the city. Marble columns flanked the massive double doors, and velvet ropes guided the wealthy attendees inside. The Harrison family had rented a ballroom that cost more for a single evening than most people earned in a decade. I walked through the gilded entrance, wearing the oversized yellow disaster my mother forced upon my shoulders. The air inside hummed with the sound of a string quartet tuning their instruments. I navigated past towering floral arrangements toward the grand staircase where the formal portraits were already underway. The photographer was a tall, frantic man with a severe haircut and a heavy clipboard. Diane stood right beside his elbow, pointing at the bridal party and whispering sharp instructions into his ear. Valerie posed in the center of the steps, drowning in layers of imported white lace and sparkling tulle. Todd stood beside her, flashing a practiced hollow grin designed entirely for the cameras. I stepped onto the bottom step, taking my designated place at the far edge of the bridesmaid lineup. The photographer lowered his heavy camera. He frowned, looking directly at my waistline. "Excuse me, miss," he called out, waving a dismissive hand in my direction. "Could you shift to the second row? You are pulling focus from the bride." I stepped up to the second row, standing directly behind a woman wearing a pale pink gown. "Actually, that is still not working," the photographer sighed, checking the digital screen on his device. "The color balance is completely thrown off. That yellow fabric is washing out the ambient lighting and creating a terrible glare." Diane stepped forward, her expensive heels clicking sharply against the marble stairs. "Beverly, you are ruining the composition," she scolded, loudly enough for the entire Harrison extended family to hear. "Move to the back row. Try to blend in and stop being so difficult." I climbed to the top step. I stood behind a groomsman who was at least 6 feet tall. I was barely visible behind his broad shoulders. The photographer snapped 2 pictures before shaking his head again in frustration. "I am sorry, Mrs. Nelson. That dress is just too aggressive for this elegant color palette. It creates a visual sore thumb in every single frame." "Beverly, just step out of the picture entirely," Diane ordered, dismissing me with a quick flick of her wrist. "We will take the family portraits without you. We can always have the studio edit you into the background later if we really need to." I did not argue. I did not throw a tantrum. I walked down the cold marble steps and stood alone near a thick structural pillar. I watched my parents smile for the flashing bulbs, capturing a perfect, fabricated family history that did not include my existence. The psychological warfare was relentless, designed to grind my self-worth down to absolute zero before the dinner service began. A woman draped in a heavy velvet shawl approached my pillar a few minutes later. She held a glass of sparkling water and looked at me with a sickening mixture of morbid curiosity and deep pity. I recognized her from the rehearsal. It was Todd's Aunt Beatrice. "You poor dear Beatrice," murmured, reaching out to pat my forearm as if comforting a wounded stray dog. "Your mother told me everything." I kept my posture completely straight. "Did she?" Beatrice nodded slowly, leaning in close so the other guests would not overhear. "Diane explained how difficult this past year has been for you. Losing your employment must have been devastating, and the nervous breakdown following your termination, well, mental health struggles are nothing to be ashamed of in this day and age." My pulse throbbed against my collarbone. Diane had not just erased my wealth, she had completely rewritten my entire biography. She painted me as an unstable, destitute failure to explain why I was isolated and wearing a cheap, ill-fitting garment. It was a brilliant preemptive strike. If I tried to tell anyone I owned the $5 million penthouse, they would just view it as the tragic delusion of a broken mind. "Diane told us how you invent these little business fantasies to cope with your situation," Beatrice whispered, squeezing my wrist. "It is so brave of you to even attend today, considering your fragile state." "I appreciate your concern, Beatrice," I said quietly, refusing to confirm or deny the outrageous lie. I knew that correcting her would only sound offensive, proving my mother's narrative of instability. Beatrice offered one last tragic sigh before drifting back toward the wealthy crowd, leaving me alone with the staggering weight of my family's deception. The ceremony concluded in a blur of fake vows and orchestrated tears. The guests transitioned into the main reception hall. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm, golden glow over 50 circular tables draped in heavy white linen. Gold-trimmed plates rested at every setting. I located the seating chart displayed on a massive mirrored board near the entrance. Richard and Diane sat at the head table with the bride and groom. The Harrisons occupied the prestigious tables surrounding the polished dance floor. I scanned the alphabetical list for my name. It was not grouped with the extended relatives. It was not placed with the college friends. I found my assignment. Table 42. I walked across the vast ballroom, passing table after table of laughing guests. The numbers climbed higher the further I walked from the stage. I reached the absolute back of the room. Table 42 was not a grand circular dining setup. It was a tiny, rectangular folding table covered with a cheap white cloth, crammed into a dark corner directly next to the swinging metal doors of the catering kitchen. It was positioned next to a large plastic utility bin where the waitstaff dumped dirty silverware. There was only one chair. I sat down. I was a neon target of disrespect. Every time a hurried waiter rushed through the swinging doors, a gust of hot, grease-scented air hit the back of my neck. The loud clatter of ceramic plates and shouted kitchen orders drowned out the elegant string music playing for the rest of the room. I sat alone, in my oversized yellow dress, entirely separated from the 200 guests celebrating a fraudulent union. I rested my hands on my lap. The manila folder holding their financial ruin was tucked safely inside my leather purse by my feet. I absorbed the humiliation, letting it fuel the cold focus required for the impending confrontation. The room buzzed with lively conversation. Waiters began pouring the first round of expensive vintage wine. Up at the front of the room, seated at a prime table designated for honored VIPs, my grandfather Henry observed the spectacle. He saw me. Through the sea of tailored suits and designer gowns, his sharp eyes located the bright yellow fabric banished to the kitchen doors. Henry did not speak to Richard. He did not say a single word to Diane, who was busy waving at a wealthy investor across the room. Henry grabbed the solid silver handle of his cane. He pushed his chair back. He stood up. In a room dominated by social climbing and superficial wealth, true power commands attention without making a sound. The guests at the nearby tables noticed the patriarch rising. The conversation in the immediate vicinity died down instantly. Henry stepped away from the VIP seating area. He began walking down the center aisle of the ballroom. His silver cane struck the polished hardwood floor with a steady, rhythmic thud. 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 Diane noticed the movement out of the corner of her eye. Her plastic smile faltered. She half rose from her seat at the head table, clearly confused. She expected him to walk toward the restroom, or perhaps approach the open bar. He did neither. Henry walked straight past the dance floor. He walked past the Harrisons. He bypassed his golden child sitting at the altar of her own deceit. The silence rippled outward, spreading like a fast-moving wave across the massive room. 200 guests stopped talking. Forks hovered midway to mouths. The clinking of glasses ceased entirely. Henry navigated the final rows of tables and arrived at my dark corner by the kitchen doors. He looked at the tiny folding table. He looked at the plastic bin of dirty silverware. He looked at me. He turned around, facing a terrified waiter holding a heavy tray of bread rolls. "Bring me a chair," Henry commanded. His voice was not loud, but it carried absolute, unquestionable authority. The waiter scrambled, dragging a heavy wooden chair from a nearby empty table. He placed it directly next to mine. Henry lowered himself into the seat. He rested his cane against the edge of the cheap tablecloth. He picked up the single cloth napkin provided for my table, unfolded it with deliberate care, and placed it across his lap. The silence in the ballroom was absolute and deafening. The entire guest list watched the wealthiest man in the room abandon the seat of honor to sit in exile with the family outcast. Diane looked like she had been struck by lightning, her face drained of all color. Richard stared at his father, his jaw hanging slightly open, realizing a massive variable had just entered their carefully controlled equation. Valerie gripped the edge of the head table, her knuckles turning white against the white linen. The visual statement was undeniable. The patriarch had chosen a side, and he did it without raising his voice a single decibel. Henry reached across the small table and patted my hand once. "The view is much better from back here," Henry said quietly, his eyes locked on my parents. "You can see every snake in the grass." I nodded, a genuine smile touching my lips for the first time in 2 days. Before Diane could formulate a plan to retrieve him, the ballroom lights dimmed. A bright spotlight hit the center stage. The hired DJ stepped up to a microphone stand, his booming voice shattering the suffocating quiet. "Ladies and gentlemen," the DJ announced, his enthusiasm wildly out of place against the sudden heavy tension gripping the room. "Please direct your attention to the head table. It is time to begin the reception speeches." The extortion trap was officially armed. My mother's deadline had arrived. I reached down and touched the leather strap of my purse, feeling the solid weight of the documents inside. The spotlight swept away from our dark corner, illuminating the center stage, where the DJ stood. The hired entertainment tried to hype up a crowd that was still stealing confused glances at my grandfather sitting by the kitchen doors. Henry ignored the murmurs. He reached inside his tailored suit jacket and withdrew a plain manila envelope. He placed it flat on the cheap white tablecloth between my water glass and the plastic cutlery bin. I stared at the thick paper. "What is this?" I asked. Henry kept his eyes trained on the head table where Diane was frantically whispering into Richard's ear. "That is the anatomy of a sinking ship," he replied. He instructed me to open it. I peeled back the metal clasp. Inside sat a stack of printed documents, bank statements, and court filings. The top page featured the letterhead of a premier private investigation firm based out of Chicago. "I hired them 30 days ago," Henry explained, his voice low and steady over the thumping bass of the background music. "Your father came to my office last month asking for a bridge loan. He claimed it was a short-term cash flow issue related to a new commercial venture. But Richard never asks for help unless he is already drowning." His hands were shaking when he held the coffee cup I offered him. I knew he was lying. So I paid professionals to find the truth. I turned the first page. A spreadsheet detailed my parents' current financial reality. The numbers were staggering, but not in the way they projected to the world. Read the highlighted sections, Henry instructed. My eyes scanned the yellow marker lines. Richard and Diane possessed zero liquid capital. Their checking accounts were overdrawn. Their credit cards carried maxed-out balances across 5 different banking institutions. The sprawling suburban estate they loved to brag about was currently buckling under the weight of 3 separate mortgages. Notice of default letters were attached to the file, stamped and dated by a county judge. "They are facing imminent bankruptcy," I whispered, feeling the cold air from the kitchen door hit the back of my neck. "They are 30 days away from living in a cardboard box," Henry corrected bluntly. "The country club memberships, the luxury vehicles, the designer suits they are wearing tonight, it is all funded by fraudulent credit extensions. They are running a Ponzi scheme on their own lives." I flipped to the next section of the dossier. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The blackmail threat my mother delivered that morning in the guest bedroom was not a display of power. It was an act of sheer, feral desperation. They did not just want my New York asset to upgrade their lifestyle. They needed the deed to my home to prevent federal creditors from seizing everything they owned. Then I saw the next tab in the folder. It bore the name Todd Harrison. I frowned, looking up at my grandfather. "Why did you investigate the groom?" Henry took a sip of his water. "Because con artists rarely operate in a vacuum. I wanted to know exactly who was marrying into my bloodline." "Turn the page, Beverly." I did. Todd Harrison did not belong to a dynasty of old money. He did not possess a trust fund. The private investigator uncovered a trail of financial wreckage that mirrored my parents' disaster. Todd was a professional parasite. The documents revealed a string of failed businesses and staggering gambling liens. He owed hundreds of thousands of dollars to offshore bookmakers. His parents, Winston and Victoria, the couple currently sitting near the dance floor sipping vintage wine, were renting their luxury vehicles. Their primary residence was locked in a bitter foreclosure battle. "They are broke," I said, the absurdity of the situation finally taking root in my mind. "They are worse than broke," Henry noted. "They are predators, looking for a host." I stared at the paperwork, piecing the grand illusion together. The entire wedding was a spectacular, expensive sham. It was a collision of 2 bankrupt families, both faking immense wealth, each hoping to drain the other's fictional bank accounts. Richard and Diane thought they were marrying Valerie off to a billionaire who would solve their cash flow problems. Winston and Victoria thought their son was securing a wealthy heiress who could pay off his gambling markers. Neither side had a dime to their name. The only actual tangible wealth in the entire ballroom was sitting at a folding table next to a trash bin. My penthouse was the sole lifeline capable of saving both families from total financial ruin. That is why Todd was snooping in my office, I realized aloud, remembering the hidden camera footage. He was verifying the deed to ensure the asset was real. "And that is why your mother is threatening your career to secure the property transfer tonight," Henry added. "If Todd discovers Valerie is penniless before the marriage is finalized, the Harrisons will flee. If Richard fails to secure your real estate, the bank seizes his estate on Monday. They are all trapped in a burning building, and you hold the only key to the exit." I closed the manila folder. I slid it back across the tablecloth. The heavy, scratchy polyester of my yellow dress suddenly felt like armor. My mother tried to humiliate me by forcing me into the shadows, but the shadows were exactly where I needed to be to see the entire battlefield clearly. "What happens now?" I asked, tracing the edge of my glass. Henry placed his hands flat on the table. He looked toward the stage with eyes that held zero pity. "They are going to try to force your hand tonight. They believe the pressure of a public audience will break your resolve. Let them try." The music swelled. The DJ handed a wireless microphone to Todd's best man. The young man tapped his spoon against a crystal champagne flute. The sharp ringing sound cut through the remaining chatter, demanding absolute silence from the wealthy crowd. The best man offered a short, practiced joke about the groom, earning a polite ripple of laughter from the audience. Then he turned his attention toward the head table. "But we all know tonight is really about family," the best man proclaimed, his voice echoing through the large speakers. "And no one understands the value of family better than the man who made this beautiful evening possible." He walked across the polished wood floor and extended his hand. Richard stood up. He adjusted his tailored jacket, flashing a brilliant, confident smile to the applauding guests. He reached out and took the microphone. The highly anticipated Father of the Bride speech was about to begin. The trap was springing shut. Richard held the microphone close to his mouth. He stepped out from behind the head table and walked directly under the center chandelier. The crystal prisms cast tiny, fractured rainbows across his expensive tuxedo. He was in his element. He spent 40 years selling commercial real estate, and tonight, he was pitching the biggest sale of his life. "Thank you all for being here to witness this union," Richard began, his voice echoing smoothly through the ballroom speakers. "Looking out at this crowd, I see generations of friendship, business partnerships, and above all, unwavering loyalty." He paced slowly across the polished wood floor. He knew exactly how to work a room full of rich people. He spoke about the struggles of raising children, the sleepless nights, and the profound joy of seeing a daughter find her true protector. He gestured toward Todd, nodding with deep, fabricated respect. "Todd, you are a man of exceptional character," Richard proclaimed. "You come from a lineage of strength and integrity. Winston, Victoria, you raised a remarkable son. We are honored to merge our legacies with yours." The Harrisons smiled graciously from their seats near the dance floor. They raised their glasses in silent acknowledgement. The irony was suffocating. Two destitute fathers were toasting to their mutual financial ruin, each believing they were robbing the other blind. Richard stopped pacing. He planted his feet firmly and lowered his head, pressing a hand to his chest. He took a slow, deep breath, expertly manufacturing a moment of raw vulnerability. "But tonight is not just about the bride and groom," Richard continued, his tone shifting into a softer, thicker register. "It is about the foundation that makes their future possible. It is about the bonds of blood. It is about sacrifice." He turned his gaze away from the VIP section. He looked past the expensive floral centerpieces. His eyes locked on to the dark corner by the kitchen doors. "Valerie has always been the heart of our household," Richard said, his voice cracking with artificial emotion. "But she is not an only child. She has an older sister. A sister who understands that true success means nothing unless you share it with the people you love." The murmurs began. Guests turned their heads, scanning the shadows at the edges of the venue, trying to locate this devoted sibling. Richard raised his free hand, pointing a single finger straight at my table. "Beverly, please stand up," Richard requested over the sound system. I did not move. I remained seated next to Henry. My grandfather folded his hands over his silver cane and watched the performance with the detached interest of a scientist observing a desperate rat in a maze. Richard did not let my refusal slow his momentum. He smiled wider, playing the role of a proud, indulgent patriarch. "She is shy," Richard chuckled, earning a warm wave of laughter from the audience. "She has always preferred the background, but tonight her generosity demands the spotlight." He took 2 steps closer to the edge of the stage. He gripped the microphone with both hands. When Valerie and Todd announced their engagement, Beverly came to me in private. Richard lied effortlessly. She told me she wanted to ensure her little sister started this new chapter on the strongest possible footing. She wanted to provide a foundation that reflected the deep, unbreakable bond they share. The crowd was captivated. They leaned forward in their chairs, eager to hear the details of this grand gesture. So it is with immense pride and overwhelming gratitude that I announce my eldest daughter's wedding gift to the new couple," Richard declared, his voice rising in volume and intensity. "Beverly has officially agreed to sign over the deed to her New York penthouse, transferring full ownership to Valerie and Todd tonight." The reaction was instantaneous. The ballroom erupted. 200 wealthy guests gasped in collective shock, followed immediately by a deafening roar of applause. Men in tailored suits whistled. Women in designer gowns dabbed their eyes with linen napkins. It was the ultimate display of high society philanthropy, a fairy tale gesture unfolding right before their eyes. At the head table, Valerie sprang out of her chair. She covered her mouth with both hands, her shoulders shaking as she forced fake tears to stream down her cheeks. She looked like a pageant winner accepting a crown. She turned and threw her arms around Todd's neck. Todd hugged her back, but his eyes were wide open. He looked out over the cheering crowd with a smug, triumphant grin. He believed he had just hit the jackpot. He believed his gambling markers were secured and his future was permanently funded. A technician operating the venue lighting system caught the cue. A bright, blinding white spotlight snapped on, swinging rapidly across the dark ceiling. The beam sliced through the dim room and locked directly onto table 42. I was instantly illuminated. The bright light caught the hideous yellow polyester of my oversized dress, turning the fabric into a glowing beacon. Every single face in the room turned to look at me. 200 pairs of eyes stared through the blinding light. The applause swelled louder. They were cheering for me. They were celebrating my incredible generosity. They were waiting for me to stand up, wave my hand, and embrace the role of the self-sacrificing savior. It was a psychological pressure cooker designed by a master manipulator. Richard knew I avoided public conflict. He knew I operated in corporate environments where maintaining decorum was paramount. He wagered his entire survival on the belief that I would be too embarrassed, too paralyzed by social convention to stand up and call him a liar in front of hundreds of cheering strangers. He thought I would nod smile for the cameras and figure out the legal nightmare later behind closed doors. He thought the sheer weight of public expectation would crush my spine. I sat perfectly still. I did not smile. I did not nod. I looked straight through the glare of the spotlight, keeping my face as rigid as carved stone. The applause began to plateau. A few confused whispers drifted from the closest tables. Why was I not standing? Why was I not crying along with my sister? The narrative Richard constructed was hitting a brick wall of silence. That is when Diane made her move. She stood up from the head table. She did not walk around the edge of the dance floor. She marched straight down the center aisle, cutting a path directly through the standing ovation. Diane carried a crisp blue linen folder in her left hand. In her right hand, she held a thick gold fountain pen. Her slate gray suit caught the edge of the spotlight as she approached my dark corner. She wore a brilliant, camera-ready smile. It was the same smile she used to charm charity board members and country club presidents. But as she drew closer, the artificial warmth in her eyes vanished, leaving only a sharp, predatory calculation. She reached table 42. The hired photographer was hot on her heels, his camera lens focused tight on our interaction. The flashbulb started popping, capturing the supposed emotional climax of the evening. Diane flipped the blue folder open and slapped it down onto the cheap tablecloth right next to my water glass. It was a printed quitclaim deed. My name was typed clearly at the top. The document legally surrendered all my rights to the Manhattan property, transferring ownership immediately to Valerie Harrison and Todd Harrison. Diane leaned over the table. She positioned her body to block Henry from the photographer's view. She pressed the gold pen down on top of the signature line. "Sign the paper right now." Beverly Diane whispered through clenched teeth, her wide smile never leaving her face. Do it, or I take that microphone and end your career before the dessert is served. The trap was fully sprung. The cameras were waiting, the crowd was watching. My mother stood over me, demanding the keys to my life. She expected surrender. She expected panic. She had no idea she just handed me the exact weapon I needed to destroy her. The flash from the photographer's camera blinded me for a fraction of a second. When my vision cleared, a shiny gold fountain pen was hovering inches from my fingers. Diane tapped the heavy metal barrel against the signature line of the quitclaim deed. She angled her face perfectly toward the camera lens, maintaining a flawless expression of maternal affection for the crowd. But her eyes were wide, bloodshot, and terrifying. "Sign it right now," Diane whispered. Her voice was barely a breath, hidden beneath the swelling music and the fading cheers of the ballroom. "Or I take that microphone from your father. I will tell these people you are under federal investigation for wire fraud. I will tell them you embezzled the startup funds from a charity. Sign it, or you lose everything you built." The hired orchestra transitioned into a soaring romantic melody meant to accompany a heartwarming family embrace. The crowd waited in the dim light. They expected me to pick up the pen, scribble my name across the dotted line, and fall into my mother's arms, weeping with sisterly devotion. My pulse hammered against my throat. A rush of adrenaline flooded my veins, hot and primal. This was the exact scenario that broke people. Social convention is an invisible prison. Human beings are conditioned to avoid public embarrassment at all costs. We smile when we are insulted at dinner parties. We laugh at jokes that are not funny. We comply with outrageous demands simply because causing a scene feels worse than suffering in silence. Diane weaponized that human instinct. She bet my $5 million home on the assumption that I would rather surrender than endure the awkwardness of ruining a luxury wedding reception. She forgot who she was dealing with. I spent my 20s pitching software solutions to rooms filled with hostile venture capitalists. I sat across polished mahogany tables from men who tried to intimidate me, to steal my patents and bankrupt my firm. I learned a crucial lesson during those brutal negotiations. Panic is a choice. You only lose control of a room when you allow the other side to dictate the tempo. I took a slow, deep breath. The scratchy fabric of the yellow dress chafed against my collarbone. I let the cold air from the kitchen vents cool the sweat forming on the back of my neck. I did not reach for the gold pen. I did not look at the legal document. I pushed my folding chair back. The metal legs scraped harshly against the hardwood floor. The sound was sharp, cutting through the romantic music. I stood up slowly. Diane leaned in closer, anticipating my compliance. Her hand hovered over the blue linen folder, ready to snatch the paper away the second my ink dried. Instead of picking up the pen, I simply clasped my hands together in front of my waist. I squared my shoulders. I looked directly into Diane's desperate eyes. I did not raise my voice. I did not speak a single syllable. I offered her nothing. The silence began to stretch. 10 seconds passed. In normal life, 10 seconds is a brief pause. In front of a captive audience waiting for a specific reaction, 10 seconds feels like an agonizing eternity. The thunderous applause began to falter, the clapping thinned out, the rhythmic cheering devolving into a smattering of confused, disjointed smacks. The photographer lowered his camera. He looked at Diane, then at me, sensing the toxic energy radiating from our table. He took a step backward, letting his expensive equipment hang loose around his neck. 15 seconds. The music played on, but the ballroom grew eerily quiet. The guests at the nearest tables shifted in their seats, necks craned, whispers broke out among the crowd. The wealthy socialites and business partners exchanged bewildered glances. They watched a mother holding a pen and a daughter refusing to take it. The beautiful illusion Richard constructed on stage was rapidly falling apart. I shifted my gaze away from Diane. I looked across the vast room toward the head table. Valerie was still standing. Her hands were still cupped over her mouth, but the fake tears dried up instantly. Her posture turned stiff. The smug satisfaction of her impending victory melted into stark confusion. She shot a panicked look toward our father. Richard stood beneath the crystal chandelier, the microphone gripped tightly in his sweating hand. His confident salesman smile froze, turning into a rigid, unnatural grimace. He bounced slightly on his heels, unsure how to salvage the dying momentum. He expected me to cave immediately. He possessed no backup plan for silent defiance. Todd Harrison was no longer smiling. The groom leaned over the head table, his brow furrowed in deep irritation. He stared at the blue folder sitting on my cheap tablecloth, recognizing that his financial salvation was stalling. His parents, Winston and Victoria, began whispering frantically to each other, sensing the instability of the situation. The pressure my mother intended to drop on my shoulders reversed direction. It hit her like a tidal wave. By doing nothing, I forced her to bear the entire weight of the awkwardness. She was the one standing over a seated guest, holding a legal contract. She was the one looking unhinged. 20 seconds. The applause died completely. The silence in the venue became absolute, thick, and suffocating. Even the string quartet seemed to realize something was terribly wrong, their playing turning hesitant and out of tune. Diane's flawless facade cracked. The fundraiser smile twitched at the corners. A vein pulsed visibly at her temple. She was losing the room. "Sign the paper," Diane hissed again. Her voice lost its smooth, menacing edge. It cracked with raw panic. "Everyone is looking at us. Do not make a fool out of your sister." I maintained my silence. I looked at her with clinical detachment, observing a predator, realizing it was caught in a snare. Her chest heaved. The slate gray suit jacket trembled as her breathing turned shallow and rapid. She realized the quiet intimidation strategy was a catastrophic failure. I was not going to break. I was not going to sign away my future to fund her fraudulent lifestyle. The feral desperation took over. If I would not submit to the quiet threat she was going to deploy, the loud one. She was going to execute the nuclear option right then and there. Diane took a step back from the table. She squared her shoulders toward the crowd. She inhaled a deep breath of air, her chest expanding. Her eyes widened with fury. She opened her mouth, preparing to scream her fabricated lies. She was ready to announce to 200 people that I was a criminal, an embezzler, a fraud under federal investigation. She was ready to burn my life to the ground to save her own skin. Her lips parted. The first syllable formed in her throat. A sharp, piercing sound sliced through the heavy silence. Clink, clink, clink. It was the distinct, high-pitched ring of silver striking crystal. Diane froze. The breath she took remained trapped in her lungs. She snapped her head toward the source of the noise. Every guest in the ballroom turned their attention away from our standoff. The eyes of the crowd shifted a few feet to the left. Henry Nelson sat in the cheap folding chair beside me. He held a heavy silver soup spoon in his right hand. He tapped it methodically against the rim of his crystal water glass. He did not look at Diane. He did not look at me. His sharp, unforgiving eyes were locked dead ahead, aimed directly at his son standing on the stage. The patriarch had seen enough. The silent observer was officially entering the fray. The ringing sound of the silver spoon striking the crystal glass cut through the thick tension like a scalpel. The sharp noise echoed across the ballroom, amplified by the sudden silence of the crowd. Diane snapped her mouth shut. The breath she had drawn to scream her fabricated accusations rushed out of her lungs in a quiet, ragged gasp. She whipped her head around, her eyes darting toward the source of the interruption. Henry Nelson placed the heavy soup spoon back onto the cheap white tablecloth. He gripped the silver handle of his walking cane with both hands. He shifted his weight, pushing his chair back, and stood up from the folding table. He was 78 years old. He did not possess the booming, theatrical voice of his son. He did not wear a flashy tuxedo. But as he drew himself up to his full height in the dark corner of the venue, the entire social hierarchy of the room realigned itself around him. In a gathering built on the worship of money and status, my grandfather represented the undisputed apex. He was the patriarch, the founder of the family empire, and the presumed source of the inheritance everyone on stage was trying to claim. When a man holding that much perceived power decides to stand, the room defers to him by pure instinct. Diane took a stumbling step backward. Her slate-gray suit shifted as she quickly tried to hide the blue linen folder behind her hip. The fierce, predatory glare she had leveled at me vanished, replaced by a wide, terrified uncertainty. She opened her mouth to speak, perhaps to offer a frantic excuse for why she was looming over my table with a legal document, but Henry did not give her the chance. He did not look at her. He did not say a single word to the woman who had just tried to blackmail his granddaughter. He simply stepped around the small table and began his march down the center aisle. He did not rush. Henry walked with the heavy, undeniable authority of a man who actually owns the ground he stands on. His silver cane struck the polished hardwood floor in a slow, steady rhythm. The guests seated at the tables closest to the kitchen doors parted instinctively, pulling their chairs in to clear a wider path for him. I remained seated in my oversized yellow dress, watching the back of his tailored suit. The blinding white spotlight that had been meant to humiliate me shifted its focus. The venue technician, realizing the focal point of the drama had changed, tracked Henry's progress, bathing him in a crisp circle of light as he made his way toward the front of the ballroom. Up on the center stage, Richard was deteriorating rapidly. The confident, tear-jerking salesman who had charmed the audience moments earlier was gone. A sheen of nervous sweat coated his forehead. He gripped the wireless microphone so tightly, his knuckles turned pale. He tried to project a welcoming smile, but his lips merely stretched into a rigid, panicked grimace. He bounced on the balls of his feet, watching his father approach with a mixture of forced deference and underlying terror. Dad Richard called out over the sound system, his voice lacking its previous smooth resonance. It sounded thin and reedy. "Come on up here. Say a few words to the happy couple." Henry did not smile in return. He reached the edge of the stage and bypassed the short set of stairs, opting instead to stand directly on the ballroom floor, positioning himself at eye level with the seated guests. He stopped right in front of where Richard stood elevated above him. Henry held out his free hand, his palm facing upward. He did not ask for the microphone. He waited for it to be surrendered. Richard hesitated. He looked out at the 200 faces staring back at him. He looked at the Harrisons seated near the dance floor. He looked at Valerie in her expensive white gown. He was holding the only tool that allowed him to control the narrative, and he knew that giving it up meant surrendering his leverage. But refusing his wealthy father in front of high society was social suicide. With a trembling hand, Richard lowered his arm and placed the microphone into Henry's waiting palm. The physical transfer of power sent a visible shockwave through the bridal party. Valerie dropped her hands from her face. The fake tears of joy she had been weeping for the cameras dried up in an instant. Her posture went rigid. Todd stepped away from his bride, the smug, triumphant grin sliding right off his face. He eyed the older man with sudden, profound suspicion. Henry adjusted his grip on the microphone. He turned his back on his son. He faced the crowd. He did not clear his throat. He did not offer a warm greeting. He looked directly at Winston and Victoria Harrison. The parents of the groom sat at their premium table, their wine glasses resting untouched on the linen. Victoria reached up and touched her pearl necklace, her eyes wide with confusion. Winston shifted uncomfortably in his rented tuxedo, sensing a shift in the wind that he could not yet identify. Then Henry turned his gaze back over his shoulder, looking up at Richard. "Let us talk about the cost of this wedding," Richard Henry said over the speakers. His tone was not angry. It was not bitter. It was conversational, precise, and entirely devoid of emotion. It was the tone of an auditor finding a fatal discrepancy in a ledger. The sudden pivot hit the room like a physical shock. The guests had been primed for a heartwarming toast about sisterly love and grand real estate gifts. They expected sentimental platitudes. The abrupt mention of financial costs broke the illusion of the fairy tale instantly. Whispers ignited across the back tables. Business partners leaned closer to their spouses. The audience realized the script had been thrown out, and something raw and unscripted was unfolding. Richard went visibly pale. The remaining color drained from his cheeks, leaving his face the shade of old parchment. He opened his mouth, stammering for a response, but no sound came out. Halfway down the center aisle, Diane froze. She stood stranded between the stage and my dark corner, trapped in the crossfire. She clutched the blue folder to her chest like a shield, staring at her father-in-law with unblinking dread. Henry reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket. His movements were unhurried and deliberate. The crowd watched with bated breath as he withdrew a single sheet of heavy stock paper. It was the summary page from the private investigator's dossier. He unfolded the crisp paper, the sound amplifying slightly through the microphone. "I have always despised fiction," Henry announced to the silent room. "I find that stories are usually invented to hide a much less flattering reality, and tonight this room has been subjected to a staggering amount of fiction." He held the paper by the edge, letting it catch the glare of the spotlight. "My son just stood on this stage and told you a beautiful story about family unity." Henry continued, his voice echoing evenly off the vaulted ceiling. "He told you about a luxurious Manhattan penthouse being offered as a wedding gift. He painted a picture of a prosperous family welcoming a wealthy new son into the fold. It was a spectacular pitch." Henry paused, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make the bridal party squirm. Valerie clutched the edge of the head table, her knuckles stark white against the dark wood. "But, as a man who values accurate accounting, I find myself obligated to make a few corrections," Henry stated. The guests were hooked. The wealthy socialites, the corporate colleagues, the extended relatives, every single person in the venue sat on the edge of their seats. They were a crowd that fed on scandal, and they recognized they were about to be served a feast. "I have a few corrections to make regarding the true ownership of the penthouse in question," Henry said, his eyes scanning the crowd. "I have a few corrections to make regarding the supposed wealth of the Nelson family hosting this extravagant evening." He turned his head slowly, locking his unforgiving gaze on Todd. The groom took a half step backward, bumping into a tall floral arrangement. "And finally," Henry concluded, his voice dropping to a low, chilling register, "I have a few corrections to make regarding the reality of the people standing at this altar and the actual bank accounts of the groom they are celebrating." The tension in the ballroom reached a breaking point. The facade was cracking wide open. The audience waited, holding their collective breath, ready for the devastating facts that were about to systematically dismantle the villain's entire worldview. Henry adjusted his grip on the crisp sheet of paper. He cleared his throat once. The dry, raspy sound carried to the furthest corners of the venue. The guests sat paralyzed in their chairs. Nobody reached for their water glasses. Nobody dared to check their phones. 200 members of high society held their breath, waiting for the patriarch to deliver the final verdict. "First, let us address the property Richard just attempted to claim. As a family asset, Henry began. His tone remained perfectly level, stripping all emotion from the facts. The luxury unit on the Upper East Side does not belong to the Nelson Family Trust. Richard did not contribute a single dollar to the initial down payment. Diane did not co-sign the mortgage paperwork. Beverly purchased that real estate in cash 36 months ago. She funded the transaction using the initial public offering of the technology firm she built from a folding table. Henry looked directly at the crowd of corporate executives and socialites. My granddaughter worked 90-hour weeks to secure her future, Henry stated. While she coded software algorithms in a cramped apartment her parents funded, European vacations for the bride standing before you today. Richard and Diane gave Beverly zero financial backing. They offered her zero emotional support. She owes them nothing. A low hum of murmurs swept through the front tables. The investors in attendance exchanged sharp, knowing glances. Richard shrunk back against the edge of the head table. The confident real estate broker vanished. He suddenly looked like a cornered, aging man, wearing a rented tuxedo that did not fit properly. Now let us examine why my son is attempting to extort his eldest child in front of polite society. Henry continued. He held the paper higher, reading the printed ink. Richard wants you to believe he is a pillar of the community. He wants you to believe he is a generous benefactor. The truth is much colder. Richard is currently carrying 3 separate mortgages on his primary residence. All 3 accounts are in default. A collective gasp escaped from a table of Diane's country club friends. Diane squeezed her eyes shut. She pulled the blue linen folder tight against her chest, treating the useless quitclaim deed like a physical shield. Henry did not pause to let them recover. He read the exact figures without an ounce of pity. Richard and Diane hold 7 maxed-out credit lines, totaling $412,000. They owe substantial back taxes to the federal government. A county judge stamped a formal foreclosure notice on their suburban estate 9 days ago. The bank will seize their property on Monday morning. They are entirely insolvent. The silence following those numbers felt heavy enough to crush bone. The illusion of the wealthy Nelson family disintegrated into ash. The guests who had applauded Richard minutes earlier now stared at him with open disgust. In their exclusive circles, bankruptcy was a contagious disease. Nobody wanted to be caught standing near the infected. Henry lowered the paper slightly. He turned his body, aiming his sharp gaze toward the groom. Todd swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbed in his throat. He took a half-step backward, bumping into a tall floral arrangement. But a scam of this magnitude requires 2 willing participants, Henry noted. He addressed the crowd again. Richard believed he was marrying his daughter into a dynasty of established wealth. He thought the Harrison family would provide a financial parachute to save his sinking estate. Henry looked directly at Winston and Victoria Harrison. Victoria dropped her gaze to the floor, her hands trembling in her lap. Winston clenched his jaw. His face turned a blotchy, uneven shade of purple. They looked as though someone had walked up and struck them in the stomach with a baseball bat. Todd Harrison does not hold a senior vice president position at a venture capital firm, Henry declared, dismantling the groom's entire fabricated identity in one swift sentence. He was terminated from his last entry-level finance job 18 months ago. He currently lists his primary occupation as an independent day trader. Henry read from the dossier again. Todd owes over $600,000 in gambling liens to offshore sports betting syndicates. His luxury vehicles are leased and currently 4 months behind on payments. The Harrison family home is locked in a bitter probate dispute due to unpaid property taxes. Winston closed his eyes, unable to face the judgment of his peers. Victoria covered her face with her hands. The wealthy facade they projected during the rehearsal cocktail party was reduced to rubble. The ballroom felt like a vacuum. The air was sucked right out of the room. 200 people watched a slow-motion train wreck unfold on stage. Henry laid out the conspiracy in plain, verifiable English, ensuring every single person in the room understood the mechanics of the trap. "This wedding is not a celebration of love," Henry stated, his voice ringing with absolute finality. "This event is a fraudulent merger. Two bankrupt entities collided, each faking immense prosperity, each hoping to drain the other side dry. When they realized neither family possessed a single dime, they conspired to steal a self-made woman's home to cover their shared ruin." Henry looked down at the bottom of the paper. He read the final calculation. "The combined debt standing at this altar is just over $3.2 million, Henry announced. "And they tried to use Beverly to foot the bill, using public humiliation as leverage." Valerie stood frozen behind the head table. She held a crystal champagne flute in her right hand. The fairy tale she built her entire identity around evaporated in front of her eyes. Todd was not a savior. He was a parasite looking for a free ride. She was not a wealthy heiress preparing to rule Manhattan society. She was a destitute pawn caught in a humiliating public spectacle. Her fingers went limp. The crystal glass slipped from her grip. It plummeted toward the floor. The flute struck the polished marble tile and shattered loudly. The sharp, explosive sound of breaking glass echoed through the silent venue. It was a perfect physical manifestation of her broken reality. Shards of crystal scattered across the floor, catching the harsh glare of the spotlight. Richard tried to speak. He opened his mouth, raising his hands in a desperate plea for understanding, but his throat seized. There was no sales pitch left to deliver. There was no spin capable of fixing the damage. The facts were laid bare on the table, supported by legal documents, and delivered by a man whose credibility was unimpeachable. Henry folded the paper along its original crease. He slid the dossier summary back into his suit pocket. He surveyed the wreckage he had just created with clinical detachment. He had executed his duty as the patriarch. He had excised the rot from the family tree, leaving the guilty parties exposed to the harsh light of public scrutiny. The DJ standing near the soundboard slowly reached out and muted the background music entirely. The hired catering staff stopped moving. The entire venue descended into an eerie, frozen stillness, waiting to see how the exposed predators would react to being cornered in their own trap. The sharp echo of broken crystal faded into the vast space, replaced by the heavy, ragged breathing of the people standing on stage. Valerie stared blankly at the puddle of champagne soaking into the delicate lace hem of her expensive white gown. She slowly lifted her head and locked eyes with the man she just married. Todd stepped away from the wet floor. His charming posture dissolved into a rigid, aggressive stance. He marched toward Valerie, his fists clenched tightly at his sides. He did not look like a man in love. He looked exactly like a loan shark preparing to collect a bad debt. "Are you entirely broke?" Todd demanded, his voice carrying over the silent ballroom without the aid of a microphone. "Tell me the truth right now, Valerie. Is your father actually bankrupt?" Valerie recoiled, pressing her back against the edge of the head table. Her perfect makeup appeared grotesque under the harsh stage lighting. "You owe $600,000 to bookies," she shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at his chest. "You told me you were a senior vice president. You told me we were moving to a luxury loft in Tribeca." "I told you what you wanted to hear," Todd spat back, running a frantic hand through his carefully styled hair. "I needed that Manhattan penthouse to clear my markers. If I do not wire funds to my creditors by tomorrow afternoon, people are going to break my legs. You set me up." "I set you up!" Valerie screamed, her voice cracking into a shrill, hysterical pitch. "You are a fraud. You are nothing but a degenerate gambler. You gave me a fake diamond ring and empty promises." The romantic facade disintegrated into instant, vicious self-preservation. Diane watched her daughter's fairy tale implode from halfway down the center aisle. The mother of the bride snapped out of her paralyzed state. She dropped the useless blue linen folder onto the floor and charged toward the front of the venue. Diane scrambled up the short wooden stairs, her slate gray skirt twisting awkwardly around her knees. She lunged toward Henry, desperate to seize the microphone and stop the bleeding before the damage became permanent. "Give me that device!" Diane shrieked, reaching out with clawed fingers toward the metal cylinder in my grandfather's hand. "You senile old fool! You do not know what you are saying!" Henry simply stepped to the left. He executed a casual, unbothered sidestep, letting his furious daughter-in-law stumble right past him. Diane tripped over the thick black microphone cord and slammed her hands down hard on the wooden floorboards to brace her fall. She scrambled to her knees, panting heavily. She grabbed the metal stand for balance, spinning around to face the audience. Her hair fell wildly out of its elegant updo, hanging in sweaty strands across her face. "Do not listen to him!" Diane hollered at the crowd, her voice raw and dripping with panic. "My father-in-law is confused. His mind is deteriorating rapidly. Beverly manipulated him. She poisoned him against us because she is terribly jealous of her younger sister. Beverly fabricated those financial documents. It is a textbook case of elder abuse." The 200 guests were no longer a polite, compliant audience. They were captive witnesses to a spectacular financial crime scene. Several high society matrons gasped, covering their mouths in sheer horror. Men in tailored suits reached into their jacket pockets. The bright glow of smartphone screens illuminated the dark ballroom like a constellation of stars. Dozens of digital cameras pointed directly at the stage, recording every pathetic second of the meltdown. The wealthy socialites were capturing the destruction of the Nelson family reputation in high-definition video. Near the polished dance floor, a different kind of survival instinct kicked into gear. Winston Harrison grabbed his wife firmly by the elbow. Victoria was sobbing quietly into her hands, deeply humiliated by the public exposure of their poverty. Winston showed zero emotion. He yanked her up from her chair with brutal efficiency. They did not rush the stage to defend their son. They did not attempt to explain away the gambling debts or the looming foreclosure on their own home. Winston recognized a fatal blow when he saw one. He steered Victoria away from the premium tables, keeping their movements confined to the deep shadows along the perimeter of the venue walls. I sat by the kitchen doors and watched them abandon their only child. Winston and Victoria slipped through a heavy set of velvet curtains, pushed open the side exit doors, and vanished into the Manhattan night before anyone could ask them for a statement. They left Todd alone to face the catastrophic consequences of their collective scam. Back on stage, the villains turned on each other like starved animals trapped in a cage. Todd realized his parents had abandoned the building. He whipped his head around, searching the empty chairs near the dance floor. Raw terror finally set into his arrogant features. "Where did they go?" Todd muttered, taking another unsteady step backward. "Where are my parents?" Richard finally found his voice. The humiliated real estate broker lunged forward, grabbing Todd roughly by the lapels of his rented tuxedo. "You parasitic con artist," Richard roared, shaking the younger man violently. "You came into my home. You drank my expensive liquor. You promised to take care of my daughter. You were trying to steal my property." "Your property," Todd laughed, emitting a harsh, ugly sound that echoed through the tense room. "You do not own anything, Richard. Your father just proved you are a broke, desperate old man pretending to be a king. I was trying to steal Beverly's property because you sure as hell did not possess a single asset worth taking." Richard swung his fist. It was a sloppy, uncoordinated punch driven by pure, unfiltered humiliation. The blow connected solidly with Todd's cheekbone, sending the groom stumbling backward into the massive 5-tier wedding cake displayed on a rolling cart. The expensive dessert toppled over, crashing onto the hardwood floor in a massive heap of white frosting and crushed vanilla sponge. Todd landed right in the middle of the mess, ruining his tuxedo and smearing icing across his face. Valerie screamed, dropping to her knees beside the ruined cake. She did not reach out to help her new husband up from the floor. She grabbed handfuls of the tulle skirt on her wedding gown, weeping hysterically over the sugary frosting smeared across her expensive dress. Her entire identity was tied to being the golden child marrying a billionaire. Facing the reality that she was bound to a destitute gambler broke her mind. I sat at my folding table observing the absolute destruction of my abusers. For 29 years, they commanded me to stay quiet, to accept less, and to serve their needs, while they built a towering monument to their own vanity. Now that monument was reduced to a physical brawl in a pile of ruined cake broadcast live on 50 different smartphones. They tried to use public pressure to steal my penthouse. They believed the unwritten rules of polite society would force me into total submission. Instead, that exact same social pressure was currently crushing them into dust. The venue manager, a stout man wearing a sharp black suit, burst through the swinging kitchen doors right next to my table. He held a walkie-talkie gripped tightly in his hand and looked absolutely furious. "Call the police immediately," the manager shouted into his radio, glaring at the chaotic scene unfolding on his stage. "Get security in here right now, and lock the main doors. I want the final payment for this event processed and verified before anyone else leaves this building." The threat of law enforcement injected a fresh level of terror into my parents. Richard froze, staring down at Todd lying in the cake. Diane scrambled to her feet, her eyes darting frantically around the room, searching for an escape route that did not exist. They booked this lavish venue using fraudulent credit lines, expecting to pay the final massive bill by leveraging the asset they planned to steal from me. With my property firmly out of their reach, they were trapped inside a locked building with a six-figure invoice they could never afford to pay. Henry walked slowly away from the fighting. He navigated down the wooden stairs, leaving his son and daughter-in-law to rot in the mess they orchestrated. The patriarch made his way back down the center aisle. The sea of recording smartphones parted respectfully to let him pass. He returned to my dark corner, standing beside my folding chair. He looked down at me, his sharp eyes betraying a hint of grim satisfaction as the sirens began wailing in the distance. The distant wail of approaching police sirens seeped through the thick walls of the event hall. The venue manager continued shouting instructions into his radio near the kitchen doors. In the center of the room, Richard stood over the ruined cake, gasping for air. The brawl had drained the last ounce of his false bravado. Henry raised his left hand. It was a simple gesture. He did not wave. He did not shout for order. He merely elevated his palm toward the ceiling. The effect was instantaneous. The murmuring crowd fell dead silent. The venue manager lowered his walkie-talkie. The hired security guards paused near the exits. Even Todd, covered in white frosting on the floor, stopped squirming. Decades of conditioned obedience forced my family to freeze in their tracks. The patriarch commanded the room one final time. Henry still held the wireless microphone. He took a slow breath and lifted the metal device to his mouth. The audio system hummed with static before his calm voice filled the vast space. "I came here tonight to observe," Henry stated. "I wanted to see if there was a shred of decency left in this bloodline. I needed to know if my son possessed any genuine affection for his eldest daughter, or if she was nothing more than a tool for his survival." "You provided a very clear answer." Richard swallowed hard. His throat bobbed. He took a hesitant step forward, leaving Todd behind him in the mess. "Dad, please," Richard begged. His voice was raw. It carried no authority. It was the desperate plea of a drowning man begging for a life raft. "We made a mistake. We were under immense financial pressure. I can fix this. Just help us clear the banknotes on the house." Henry shook his head. The movement was slow and filled with profound disappointment. "You cannot fix character," Richard Henry replied. "You spent your entire adult life treating people like stepping stones. You squandered every opportunity I handed you. You built a house of cards fueled by vanity and greed. When those cards began to collapse, you did not ask for help. You conspired to steal the only secure shelter your daughter built with her own two hands. Diane crawled forward on her knees. The slate-gray skirt of her designer suit snagged on a piece of broken crystal. She ignored the tear in the fabric. "Henry, you cannot abandon us!" Diane cried out, tears ruining her expensive makeup. "We are your family. Valerie is your granddaughter. She is just a victim in all of this. Todd deceived her." Valerie looked up from the floor, her eyes wide with fresh hope. She waited for her grandfather to validate her victimhood. She waited for the safety net to deploy. Henry looked down at the bride. Valerie participated in the extortion, Henry noted coldly. She wore the dress purchased with stolen credit. She mocked her sister. She demanded the electronic keys to a penthouse she did not earn. She is no victim. She is a willing accomplice to fraud. The final shred of hope vanished from Valerie's face. She slumped forward, burying her face in her hands, weeping genuine tears of despair. Henry turned his attention back to his son. The crowd of wealthy socialites leaned forward in their chairs. The cameras continued recording. They were witnessing the execution of a financial death sentence. "I met with my estate attorneys yesterday morning in Manhattan," Henry announced. The words echoed off the vaulted ceiling, striking Richard like physical blows. "I required several hours to restructure my affairs. The paperwork is signed. The documents are notarized. The changes are irrevocable." Richard stopped breathing. The last remnants of color drained from his cheeks. He knew exactly what those words meant. His entire future rested on the assumption that he would eventually inherit the Nelson Logistics fortune. That inheritance was the only reason his creditors had not thrown him in jail months ago. "I have officially disinherited you," Richard Henry declared. The sound system amplified the harsh truth. "I have removed Diane from every legal document. I have erased Valerie from the trust. None of you will receive a single cent from my accounts." A wave of shocked whispers erupted from the back tables. Disinheritance was the ultimate taboo in their wealthy circles. It was a mark of permanent exile. Richard stumbled backward. He hit the edge of the head table and grabbed the white linen tablecloth to keep from falling over. "You cannot do that." Richard gasped, his chest heaving. "We will lose the house. We will lose the cars. The bank will take everything on Monday." "They will take it all," Henry agreed without a trace of sympathy. "You will face the consequences of your own reckless spending. My vast estate is currently being liquidated. The proceeds are being transferred into a charitable trust dedicated to educational grants for underprivileged students. The wealth you coveted will go to people who actually understand the value of hard work." Diane let out a loud, piercing wail. She collapsed onto the floor, curling into a tight ball of misery. The country club lifestyle she worshipped was gone forever. She would become a pariah among her peers, a cautionary tale whispered about at dinner parties. Henry was not finished. He possessed one more legal maneuver to deploy. "I did keep one specific portion of my capital separate from the charities," Henry continued. "I instructed my attorneys to establish a substantial legal defense fund. It is a fortress of capital, locked away in a private trust." Richard looked up, his eyes bloodshot and frantic. He searched for a loophole, a tiny sliver of hope that he could access that money. "That defense fund has a single beneficiary," Henry stated, turning his head to look directly at me, sitting by the kitchen doors. "It is designed exclusively to protect Beverly. If any of you attempt to contact her, harass her, or file frivolous lawsuits to claim her real estate, that fund will activate. A team of ruthless corporate litigators will bury you in legal fees until you are sitting in a prison cell." The checkmate was total. It was financial, and it was permanent. Henry had not just removed their safety net. He had built an impenetrable wall around my life, ensuring they could never view me as prey again. They could not bully me. They could not sue me. They could not extort me. Any attempt to cross my boundaries would result in their immediate legal destruction. The ballroom remained frozen. The guests processed the sheer scale of the patriarch's retribution. He had systematically dismantled their bank accounts, their social standing, and their future prospects in front of 200 recording witnesses. Henry took a few steps toward the head table. He stopped inches away from where his son stood shivering. The patriarch looked at the man. He raised his eyes devoid of any lingering warmth. "You stood up here on this stage and called Beverly your salvation," Henry said. His voice was low, carrying a lethal sharpness. "She was the only honest thing you ever produced, and you tried to eat her alive." Richard stared at the floor. He could not meet his father's gaze. The truth was undeniable, and it broke him. "You are on your own," Henry finalized. He reached out and placed the wireless microphone down onto the polished wood of the head table. The heavy metal device struck the surface with a loud thud. The noise echoed through the speakers, a final punctuation mark on the end of the Nelson family dynasty. Henry turned his back on his son. He did not look at Diane, weeping on the floor. He ignored Valerie, kneeling in the ruined cake. He walked away from the wreckage without a second glance. He gripped his silver cane and walked down the center aisle toward my table. The crowd watched him move, their faces painted with awe and terror. They parted for him, treating him with the reverence reserved for royalty. The villains were left stranded on the stage, exposed to the glaring lights and the incoming police sirens. Their wealth was ash, their future was gone. They had nothing left but each other, and that was the cruelest punishment of all. Henry arrived at the edge of my small folding table. He stopped inches away from the plastic silverware bin. He did not say a word about the chaos erupting on the stage behind him. He simply bent his right arm and extended his elbow toward me. I picked up my leather clutch from the floor. I stood up. I reached for the heavy wool coat draped over the back of my chair and pulled it on, buttoning it all the way up to my chin. The thick fabric completely swallowed the hideous yellow polyester. I effectively erased the costume my mother forced me to wear. I looped my arm through my grandfather's elbow. A younger version of myself might have turned around. The old Beverly might have marched up to that stage, grabbed the abandoned microphone, and demanded a public apology. I spent my entire youth craving their validation. But the grueling years I spent building my software firm taught me a harsh truth about human nature. You do not demand apologies from people who view you as prey. You just remove yourself from their hunting grounds. We began our walk down the center aisle. Behind us, the remaining shreds of the fake fairy tale violently unraveled. Todd scrambled to his feet. He was coated in crushed vanilla sponge cake and sticky white frosting. He wiped a glob of icing from his eyes, his face contorted in pure rage. He did not look at his bride. He shoved a stunned waiter out of his path, knocking a silver tray to the ground. Todd stomped down the wooden stairs, his ruined tuxedo leaving a trail of crumbs across the dance floor. "Todd, wait!" Valerie screamed. She chased after him. Her expensive designer heels caught the edge of her own tulle skirt. The delicate imported lace ripped with a loud tearing sound. Valerie stumbled, catching herself on a guest table, knocking over 2 wine glasses. Todd did not even pause. He reached the heavy side exit doors, kicked the emergency release bar with his dress shoe, and plunged into the dark alleyway. He abandoned her before the caterers even had a chance to serve the main course. The marriage was functionally dead on arrival. Diane refused to accept her fate. She scrambled across the stage on her hands and knees. She shrieked my grandfather's name, her voice cracking with hysteria. She reached the edge of the platform and tried to lunge toward the aisle, desperate to grab the hem of Henry's trousers. 2 hired security guards finally intervened. They stepped into the aisle, forming a physical barrier between my mother and our retreating figures. Diane fought them. She clawed at the guard's arms, her slate-gray suit tearing at the shoulder seam. Richard remained frozen near the destroyed cake, staring blankly at the wall, a hollow shell of a man, realizing his life was over. Henry and I kept our pace slow and deliberate. We walked past the circular dining tables. The 200 high society guests watched us in stunned silence. The power dynamic in the room was entirely inverted. The people who ignored me pitied me and whispered about my supposed mental breakdown earlier in the evening, now desperately tried to catch my eye. Beatrice, the aunt who patted my arm and called me a tragic failure, shrank back in her chair. She raised a trembling hand, perhaps wanting to offer a plea for forgiveness. I looked right through her. I denied her the comfort of my attention. These socialites enabled the abuse by blindly accepting the lies. They did not deserve my anger, and they certainly did not deserve my grace. We reached the grand foyer. The elegant entrance was no longer welcoming. The venue manager stood directly in front of the main glass doors, flanked by 3 burly bouncers wearing tight black shirts. The manager held a thick stack of printed invoices in his fist. His face was flushed crimson with fury. He was actively locking down the building, preparing to trap the fraudulent hosts inside. The manager stepped forward, blocking our path to the street. "Sir, nobody is leaving this establishment until the final balances are settled," the manager barked, slapping the invoices against his palm. "The credit cards on file for the Nelson account just declined. Every single one of them." Henry did not flinch. He reached into his breast pocket and retrieved a heavy embossed business card. He handed it to the furious manager. "The Nelson Family Trust holds 0 financial liability for this event," Henry stated, his voice calm but layered with unmistakable menace. "You will find my corporate attorneys listed on that card. If you attempt to detain me or my granddaughter for a debt we did not sign for, my legal team will own this building by Tuesday. I suggest you direct your local authorities to the man shivering on the center stage." The manager looked at the business card. He recognized the name of the law firm. The anger drained from his expression, replaced by nervous compliance. He nodded sharply and snapped his fingers. The bouncers immediately stepped aside, pulling the heavy glass doors wide open. We stepped over the threshold. The crisp New York evening air hit my face. The autumn wind carried the scent of exhaust fumes, roasted nuts from a street vendor, and cold concrete. To me, it smelled like absolute freedom. The invisible crushing anvil I carried on my shoulders for 29 years instantly dissolved into the atmosphere. The desperate need to please parents who hated my independence evaporated. I was finally, truly untethered. A sleek, black town car idled at the curb. The hazard lights blinked a steady, calming rhythm. A chauffeur wearing a dark suit stood at attention, holding the rear passenger door open for us. Before we could step off the curb, a new sound pierced the city night. It started as a distant wail, quickly amplifying into a deafening roar. Flashing blue and red lights bounced off the glass storefronts across the avenue. 2 New York Police Department cruisers screeched around the corner, their tires squealing against the asphalt. They pulled up directly in front of the venue, blocking the valet lane. 4 police officers jumped out of the vehicles. They adjusted their utility belts and marched straight up the marble steps toward the entrance. The venue management did not waste a single minute. Writing 6-figure bad checks to secure a luxury ballroom constitutes felony fraud in this jurisdiction. My parents were no longer just facing bankruptcy. They were facing criminal charges. I slid into the plush leather back seat of the town car. Henry climbed in right behind me. The chauffeur closed the heavy door, sealing us inside a quiet, climate-controlled sanctuary. The blaring noise of the police sirens faded into a muffled hum. The driver shifted the vehicle into gear. We pulled away from the curb, merging smoothly into the flow of city traffic. I leaned my head against the cool, tinted glass of the window. I watched the police officers push past the venue manager and march into the grand foyer. I watched the flashing red lights shrink in the side mirror until they disappeared around a corner. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt. I left my abusers to survive the exact reality they engineered for themselves. The leather seat of the town car offered a quiet embrace as we glided through the neon-lit streets of Manhattan. I did not look out the rear window. I kept my eyes fixed on the road ahead. The city blurred past the tinted glass, taking the wreckage of my former life with it. Henry sat beside me, his hands resting on his silver cane. We rode in silence. It was not a heavy silence. It was the weightless quiet of a finished war. 6 months passed. Spring arrived in New York City, pushing the bitter winter chill away. I stood on the wraparound balcony of my penthouse on a bright Tuesday morning. The sun reflected off the glass facades of the neighboring skyscrapers, casting warm, geometric patterns across my teak patio furniture. I held a ceramic mug filled with dark roast coffee. The steam curled into the crisp morning air. Below me, the city moved with its usual relentless rhythm. Yellow cabs navigated the congested avenues. Pedestrians marched along the sidewalks, carrying briefcases and paper cups. I watched them from my sanctuary in the sky. My home belonged entirely to me. No tape measures unspooled across my hardwood floors, no hostile critics judged my modern decor. The air inside my walls felt clean, light, and perfectly still. My software company finalized a massive Series B funding round the previous afternoon. A prominent venture capital firm deposited a staggering amount of capital into our corporate accounts. We were expanding our operations to the West Coast. I spent my 20s sacrificing sleep to build that digital architecture, and the foundation was now strong enough to support an empire. I achieved the success my parents always viewed as a selfish hobby. I took a slow sip of my coffee. The rich, bitter flavor grounded me in the present moment. A sudden vibration broke the morning peace. My smartphone buzzed against the glass top of the patio table. The screen illuminated, displaying a missed call notification, followed immediately by a new voicemail alert. I did not recognize the incoming phone number. It was a local area code, but it belonged to an unregistered prepaid cellular device. I set my mug down next to the phone. I pressed my thumb against the screen, unlocking the device, and tapped the play icon on the audio message. The speakerphone engaged. The voice that echoed across my quiet balcony did not carry the polished, arrogant tone of a wealthy socialite. It sounded brittle, exhausted, and incredibly small. "Beverly, please do not hang up," the voice pleaded. "It is your mother." Diane sounded unrecognizable. The country club confidence had dissolved, leaving behind a raspy, frantic desperation. The background noise on the recording did not feature the polite clinking of crystal glasses or the smooth jazz of an expensive restaurant. I heard the loud rumble of a passing diesel truck and the distinct hum of a cheap vending machine. She was calling from a public space. I leaned against the metal railing and listened to her unravel. "We lost the house," Diane confessed, her words tumbling out in a rushed, frantic stream. "The bank executives refused to negotiate. They sent the local sheriff to change the locks on the front doors. We had exactly 2 hours to pack whatever fit into trash bags. Richard filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection, but the court officers seized everything of value to satisfy the outstanding credit accounts. They towed the cars straight out of the driveway. We do not even have a checking account anymore." She paused to take a ragged breath. I heard the unmistakable sound of a woman trying to suppress a sob. "Todd ran away," Diane continued, her voice dropping into a bitter whisper. "He vanished the morning after the reception. He stole the cash gifts from the wedding envelopes, packed a duffel bag, and disappeared. The police cannot locate him. The offshore bookies started calling Winston and Victoria, demanding payment. The Harrison family fled the state entirely. The carefully constructed fairy tale had met a brutal end. The predators consumed each other, leaving nothing but bones behind.
Valerie is not coping well, Diane whimpered. She is working the checkout register at a discount retail store out in the suburbs. She spends her entire shift folding cheap clothes for minimum wage. We are currently renting a single room in a roadside motel off the interstate. The heater barely works. The water smells like rust. We cannot live like this, Beverly. We simply cannot survive this way. The audio recording picked up the sound of a heavy door slamming shut in the background. Diane sniffled loudly. I am calling to ask for your help, Diane begged. We just need a safe place to land. We need to stay in the penthouse just for a few weeks, Beverly, just until Richard finds a new job and we can get back on our feet. You have 5 empty bedrooms up there. You have the space. You are our blood. You owe us a chance to heal as a family. The voicemail ended with a sharp click. The automated digital voice announced the message was saved. I stood on the balcony. The morning breeze ruffled the collar of my silk robe. I stared at the dark screen of my phone. I searched my chest for a reaction. I waited for the familiar knot of guilt to tighten my stomach. I waited for the childhood instinct to fix their problems, to take control of my hands. I waited to feel a sudden rush of pity for my mother, sleeping in a damp motel room. I felt nothing. The emotional reservoir I kept reserved for my parents was completely dry. I did not feel a single spark of anger. I did not wish them any further harm. I just experienced the cold, clean focus of arithmetic. They spent 29 years proving I was nothing to them but a line item on a balance sheet. They treated my ambition as a flaw until it generated wealth, and then they treated my wealth as public property. They engineered a plot to steal my home and planned to destroy my professional reputation to secure the theft. Inviting them into my penthouse would not save them. It would only allow the infection to cross my threshold. They did not want a chance to heal. They wanted a comfortable place to plot their next extraction. If I opened the door an inch, they would spend the rest of their lives trying to tear it off the hinges. I picked up the phone. I tapped the delete icon. The audio file vanished into the digital trash bin. I navigated to the call history menu. I selected the unregistered prepaid number. I tapped the block caller option. The phone issued a small confirmation beep. The barrier was permanent. They could never reach this device again. I set the phone back down on the glass table. The arithmetic was finished. The final equation balanced perfectly. I picked up my ceramic mug and walked back inside my beautiful, quiet home. The sunlight flooded through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the pristine hardwood floors and the elegant, modern furniture. The space felt expansive and full of possibility. I walked into the kitchen and poured a fresh cup of dark roast coffee. I grabbed my phone once more, this time dialing a number saved in my favorites list. The line rang twice before a familiar, steady voice answered. "Good morning," Beverly Henry said. He sounded sharp and energetic. "Good morning, Grandpa," I replied, leaning against the cool marble of the kitchen island. "I am just calling to confirm our dinner plans for this evening. I secured a table at the steakhouse you like downtown." "Excellent," Henry said. "I look forward to it. We have a lot of new investment strategies to discuss." We finalized the time and ended the call. I set the phone on the counter and took a deep breath. The world tells you that blood is an unbreakable bond. Society demands you forgive the people who share your last name no matter how much damage they inflict on your soul. But the truth is much simpler. Blood is just a biological accident. True family is not determined by a birth certificate. True family consists of the people who stand up for you when the room goes dark. True family protects you from the wolves, even when the wolves are sitting at your own dinner table. I walked over to the windows and looked out at the vast, shining city one more time. I was 29 years old. I owned my home.
I owned my company. And for the first time in my entire life, I owned my future. The screen fades to black.